What did you do to our accounts? My dad's voice exploded through the phone, so loudly, I had to pull it away from my ear. I didn't do anything to your accounts, Dad. Don't lie to me, Maya. The bank froze everything. I sat completely still. 6 days earlier, my parents had drained $75,000 from my wedding fund and handed it to my younger sister, Sophie, so she could buy her dream house. Now my father was screaming at me as if I had stolen something from him. And the strangest part, I hadn't touched a single dollar of theirs. But 6 days earlier, I hadn't known just how badly they had crossed the line. It started at dinner. My mother, Elaine, stood at the head of the table holding a glass of wine. To Sophie, she announced, she finally got her house. Everyone clapped. I smiled automatically. Then Mom looked directly at me. And Maya, sweetheart, you should be proud. You helped make this possible. My smile disappeared. What do you mean? Dad leaned back in his chair. The 75,000. My stomach dropped. What 75,000? Mom's expression hardened. Your wedding fund. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I had spent 3 years saving that money, every paycheck, every bonus, every sacrifice. It was supposed to pay for the wedding Daniel and I had been planning. I looked at Dad. You took my money. We used family money to help your sister, he said. That wasn't family money. It was in the family managed account. It was my asterisk 75,000. Dad shrugged. You're getting married. You'll figure it out. Sophie may never get another opportunity like this. Sophie stared down at her plate, while Mom reached over and squeezed her hand. Then, Mom said the words that hurt more than the theft. Don't be selfish, Maya. Your sister finally has something. I left without screaming. I didn't demand the money back. I didn't threaten anyone. I went home, opened my laptop, and pulled up the bank records. The transfer was there, but it wasn't categorized the way Dad had described it. And beneath it was another transaction I had never authorized. I stared at the screen. They didn't just take my wedding money. Then I opened the bank message, waiting in my inbox. The next morning, I sat across from my parents at their kitchen table with the bank statement between us. Dad barely glanced at it. You're making this much bigger than it needs to be. I pushed the paper toward him. $75,000 disappeared from an account I created for my wedding. Explain that. Dad folded his arms. It was family money. No, every deposit was from my paycheck. You put it in a family-managed account. Because you told me that was the safest way to save it. Mom sighed. And we used it for something important. I looked at her. My wedding isn't important. That isn't what I said. But it's what you did. Mom leaned forward. Sophie found a house she could actually afford. We had one chance to help her. And you had one chance to ask me. Dad's jaw tightened. We knew you'd say no. The room went silent. That sentence landed harder than anything else he had said. They hadn't misunderstood me. They hadn't made a mistake. They had known I would refuse and taken it anyway. I looked toward Sophie, who had been sitting quietly near the window. Did you know where the down payment came from? She immediately looked away. I thought Mom and Dad were helping me. With my money. I didn't know it was your money. Dad cut in. That's enough. Stop threatening to ruin your sister's home. I haven't threatened anything. You're acting like we're criminals. I just want my money back. Mom pushed a document across the table. Sign this. I looked down. It was a statement saying the $75,000 had been given voluntarily as a family gift. I pushed it back. I didn't give this money to anyone. Dad's face hardened. Then you're choosing to make this ugly. I stood. No, you made it ugly when you took money I told you was untouchable. I left without my money and without an apology. That afternoon, I went through 3 years of bank statements. At first, I was looking for proof of this one transfer. Instead, I found smaller withdrawals scattered across months. 5,000 here, 3,000 there. Amounts small enough that I had never questioned them, until I placed them beside the $75,000. I stared at the screen as the pattern became impossible to ignore. My parents hadn't suddenly decided to use my savings. They had been doing it before. I just hadn't noticed. And now one question wouldn't leave my mind. How long had they been treating my savings like money they could use whenever Sophie needed something? 2 days later, Mom called me while I was leaving work. "Come to Sophie's housewarming." "I don't think that's a good idea. You're her sister." "Mom, the house was bought with my wedding money." She paused. Then her voice became cold. "You're not going to punish Sophie because you're upset with us." I almost laughed. "I'm the one being punished. Just come, for the family." I should have said no. Instead, I went. The house was beautiful. Fresh paint, new floors, huge windows, a kitchen Sophie had been dreaming about for years. Relatives filled the living room, congratulating her. Then Mom lifted her glass. "And we have Maya to thank too." Every head turned toward me. Mom smiled proudly. "Maya helped make Sophie's dream possible." People started applauding. My aunt hugged me. That was incredibly generous. I couldn't speak for a second. Then she asked, "How much did you contribute?" Before I could answer, Dad laughed. 75,000. The room went quiet. He continued smiling. She wanted to help her sister. I finally spoke. "No." Dad's smile disappeared. "That wasn't a gift." I looked around the room. "That was my wedding fund. I never agreed to give it away." Nobody moved. Sophie stepped forward. "I thought Mom and Dad were helping me. They were using my money." Elaine's face flushed. "Maya, this is embarrassing." "For who?" "You're making your sister's celebration about yourself." "I didn't announce the 75,000. Dad did." Sophie looked toward our father. "Is the money really hers?" Dad didn't answer. Instead, I took out my phone. "I've already disputed the transfer with the bank." Dad scoffed. "You can't do anything. The account was jointly managed." "I know." I called the bank. A representative confirmed that my contribution records had been attached to the dispute and that the transfer was under review. I didn't explain everything to the room. I didn't have to. Dad's expression changed. For the first time, he looked uncertain. That evening, when I arrived home, there was a message waiting for me. Dad wanted me back at the house. When I arrived, he had another document waiting on the table. "Sign it," he said. I looked at the page. Another declaration that the $75,000 had been a voluntary gift. I already said no. Dad stepped closer. "If you refuse, Maya, you'll regret turning this into a legal problem." The next morning, my phone buzzed before I had even finished my coffee. It was an email from the bank. I opened it. Temporary account restriction. I read the message twice. The disputed transaction had triggered a compliance review involving several accounts connected to the transfer. I set my coffee down. This wasn't just about my complaint anymore. The bank was examining how the money had moved. I pulled up the original transaction again. My $75,000 hadn't gone directly toward Sophie's house. It had moved through multiple accounts before reaching the funds being used for the purchase. That explained the strange second transaction I had seen. I immediately gathered everything I had. Pay stubs, deposit records, wedding budgets, bank statements, and the messages where I had repeatedly told my parents the money was reserved for my wedding. I submitted them to the bank. Then my phone started ringing. Mom. Dad. Mom again. I answered. You need to withdraw the dispute, she said. No. Maya, Sophie could lose the house. They shouldn't have used my money to buy it. You're destroying your sister's future. No, I'm refusing to pay for it. Dad grabbed the phone. You deliberately froze our accounts. I didn't freeze anything. You filed the complaint. Yes, because you took my money. He went silent for a moment. Then he said, You have no idea what you've done. I think I do. The bank later told me they couldn't discuss the final outcome while the review was active, but they confirmed that the authorization trail for the transfer was being examined. That afternoon, Sophie called. Not Mom. Not Dad. Sophie. I need to talk to you. What happened? The closing might not happen. I closed my eyes. What did Dad tell you? She hesitated. He said everything was cleared. Cleared how? He told me the money was already approved and that you had no choice. I sat down. Did he say that before the transfer? Yes. That was the moment I understood. They hadn't simply assumed I'd stay quiet. They had planned around it. They had counted on me accepting the decision because they believed I would always choose family over myself. Before I could ask Sophie another question, another call interrupted us. Dad. I answered. His voice was no longer angry. It was panicked. The bank just froze everything. Dad's words stayed in my head after the call ended. The bank just froze everything. For once, I didn't feel responsible for fixing the mess. I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread in front of me and waited for the bank's review to finish. A few days later, I received the call. Ms. Reynolds, we've completed the initial review of the disputed transfer. I gripped the phone. Was the money mine? Yes. Your records clearly establish that the $75,000 came from your personal earnings and was designated for your wedding. I closed my eyes. And the transfer. The authorization documentation does not support the claim that you voluntarily gifted those funds. I looked at Daniel. He had been sitting beside me the entire time. The bank representative continued. Because the transfer passed through multiple connected accounts and the documentation was inconsistent, the transaction triggered our compliance procedures. So that was the truth. My parents hadn't been punished because I had secretly frozen their accounts. The bank had frozen the relevant accounts because their own records didn't match the story they had been telling everyone. The money had been mine. They had moved it without my authorization. And when I refused to sign a document calling it a gift, they had only created more evidence that I had never agreed. That evening, I went to my parents' house. Dad opened the door. He looked exhausted. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Nobody mentioned the house at first. Dad finally said, "The bank says the transfer wasn't authorized by you." I looked at him. You knew that. He didn't answer. You knew I would never give you $75,000 for Sophie's house. Mom's eyes filled with tears. We were trying to help your sister. And you decided my future was the easiest thing to sacrifice. She shook her head. You've destroyed this family. I looked at her quietly. No. My voice barely rose above a whisper. You destroyed my trust when you decided my wedding mattered less than Sophie's house. Dad looked down. For years, his confidence had made every family decision feel final. Now he couldn't even argue with the paperwork. Sophie eventually came over. She looked different from the confident woman standing in that beautiful house days earlier. I'm sorry, she said. I waited. I didn't know it was really your money. You knew Dad said I had no choice. She swallowed. I thought he had worked everything out. I nodded. I believe you. But believing her didn't mean pretending nothing happened. The house purchase couldn't proceed with the disputed money. Without the $75,000 available as closing funds, Sophie's purchase collapsed. She lost the house she had already imagined living in. My parents had to resolve the unauthorized transfer and repay what they had moved. And the relatives who had applauded me at Sophie's celebration eventually learned what had really happened. The same people who had called me generous stopped calling me selfish. Some apologized. Others simply became quiet. I didn't need either reaction anymore. Once my $75,000 was returned, I closed the family-managed account arrangement completely. Every dollar I earned went into an account controlled only by me. No shared passwords. No family access. No assumptions. No more explaining why my money belonged to me. Daniel and I also changed our wedding plans. We didn't try to recreate the wedding we had originally imagined. We chose something smaller, something we could pay for ourselves. And somehow, it felt better. There was no family money attached to it. No debt to my parents. No promise that someone could later claim they had paid for my happiness. Just Daniel and me, building something that belonged entirely to us. Months later, an invitation arrived for Sophie's new housewarming. She had eventually found another place after rebuilding her finances. I looked at the invitation for a long moment. Daniel asked, "Are you going?" I smiled faintly. No. He didn't ask why. He already knew. I wasn't angry anymore. But I had finally learned the difference between forgiveness and permission. I could love my family without handing them control of my future. I could care about Sophie without financing her dreams. And I could say no without feeling guilty. My parents had taken $75,000 because they believed I would always sacrifice myself to keep the family happy. They were wrong. I got my money back. I got my boundaries back. And most importantly, I got my future back. I didn't lose my wedding fund. I lost the illusion that loving my family meant letting them spend my future, and that was the one thing I would never give back.